"If you fix that machine, I'll kneel," the billionaire laughed, until the mechanic started the engine. Are you ready for an incredible story? Today you're going to discover "If you fix that machine, I'll kneel," a powerful tale about pride, respect, and how sometimes the most unexpected people can teach us the most valuable lessons. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our amazing stories. Now let's dive into this unforgettable journey. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling industrial complex of Hartwell Manufacturing, casting long shadows across the oil-stained concrete. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the asphalt, and the distant sound of machinery created a constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of anyone who worked there. It was July in Houston, and the temperature had already climbed past 95 degrees before noon. Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his weathered hands with an old rag as he approached the massive production line that had been silent for 3 days. At 52, Marcus had spent more than half his life working with machines, first in the Navy, then in various factories across the South. His calloused fingers told the story of decades spent fixing what others couldn't, solving problems that stumped engineers with fancy degrees and corner offices. The machine before him was a beast, a state-of-the-art automated assembly unit worth over $2 million. Its chrome surfaces reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, and its complex array of robotic arms sat motionless like a sleeping giant. For the past 72 hours, this machine had been the source of mounting tension throughout the entire facility. Production had ground to a halt, costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue with each passing hour. "Thompson!" The voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife. Marcus turned to see James Hartwell III striding across the factory floor, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete with each purposeful step. At 38, James was everything that money and privilege could create. Tall, impeccably dressed, even in the sweltering heat, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about where his next meal would come from. James wore a crisp white shirt that somehow remained wrinkle-free despite the oppressive humidity, and his gold Rolex caught the light as he gestured dismissively toward the silent machine. His perfectly styled hair didn't show a single bead of sweat, a stark contrast to every other person in the facility who looked like they'd been running a marathon in a sauna. "I've had a team of specialists working on this thing for 3 days, James announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Engineers from the manufacturer, technicians flown in from Germany, consultants charging me $500 an hour. Nobody can figure out what's wrong with it." Marcus nodded slowly, his experienced eyes already scanning the machine's various components. He could see the frustration in the faces of the other workers who had gathered at a respectful distance. These were good people, hard-working men and women who took pride in their jobs and worried about their families when production stopped. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "The manufacturer says it might be a complete system failure," James continued, his tone growing more agitated. "They're talking about replacing the entire control unit. That's going to cost me another $300,000 and put us behind schedule for the next 6 months. The weight of those words settled over the assembled workers like a dark cloud. 6 months behind schedule meant potential layoffs, reduced hours, and the very real possibility that some of these people might lose their jobs. Marcus could see the worry in their eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, the whispered conversations between spouses about how they'd make ends meet if things got worse. Marcus stepped closer to the machine, his trained eye taking in details that others might miss. The way certain panels were slightly askew, the faint discoloration around specific connection points, the almost imperceptible vibration in one of the support struts. After 30 years of working with machinery, He'd developed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems that escaped even the most sophisticated diagnostic equipment. "Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady and measured. "Mind if I take a look?" James let out a sharp laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. The sound was harsh and dismissive, causing several workers to wince and look away. "You? Thompson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't some old pickup truck that needs a new alternator. This is a $2 million piece of precision German engineering. The best minds in the industry have been stumped by this machine." The condescension in James's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus felt the familiar sting of being judged by his appearance rather than his abilities. He was wearing his standard work clothes, faded blue jeans with honest holes worn through years of hard work, steel-toed boots that had seen better days, and a company-issued shirt with his name embroidered over the pocket. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil and grease, marking him clearly as a man who worked with his hands rather than sitting behind a mahogany desk. "Look," James continued, gesturing broadly toward the machine, "I've got nothing against you personally, but this situation requires expertise that, frankly, you just don't have. No offense, but there's a difference between fixing a forklift and diagnosing a computer-controlled robotic assembly system." Several of the other workers exchanged glances, their faces showing a mixture of embarrassment for Marcus and frustration with their boss's attitude. These people knew Marcus's reputation. They'd seen him work miracles with equipment that everyone else had written off as hopeless. But they also knew better than to challenge James Hartwell III directly, not if they wanted to keep their jobs. Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the factory on him. The heat seemed to press down even more oppressively, and he could feel sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite his years of working in similar conditions. But there was something else burning inside him now, not just the Texas heat, but a fire that came from being underestimated, from having his 30 years of experience dismissed because he didn't have the right pedigree or wear the right clothes. "Tell you what," James said, a cruel smile playing across his lips as an idea formed in his mind. "I'm feeling generous today. If you can fix this machine, and I mean actually fix it, not just bang on it with a wrench until something starts working, I'll do something I've never done in my entire life." The factory floor fell silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning units struggling against the oppressive heat. Even the usual background chatter from other parts of the facility seemed to fade away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. "If you can get this machine running properly," James continued, his voice now loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear clearly, "I'll get down on my knees right here on this factory floor, in front of everyone. Hell, I'll admit that a simple mechanic knows more than all my expensive consultants combined." The silence that followed was deafening. Workers who had been pretending not to listen now stared openly, their faces showing a mixture of shock and anticipation. Some looked excited at the prospect of seeing their arrogant boss humbled, while others appeared nervous about the potential consequences of such a public challenge. Marcus studied James's face carefully, seeing the absolute confidence there. This wasn't just casual arrogance. James genuinely believed it was impossible for Marcus to succeed where teams of highly paid specialists had failed. In James's world, problems were solved by throwing money at them, by hiring people with impressive credentials and expensive equipment. The idea that a factory worker with grease under his fingernails could accomplish what his experts couldn't was not just unlikely, it was inconceivable. "You're serious about this?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. "Dead serious," James replied without hesitation. "But when you can't fix it, and you won't be able to, I want you to publicly admit that you were out of your league. I want you to acknowledge that some problems require real expertise, not just good intentions and elbow grease." The stakes had just been raised considerably. This was no longer just about fixing a machine. It was about respect, dignity, and the value of experience versus education. It was about whether someone could be judged by their appearance and background, or whether their actual abilities mattered more. Marcus looked around at the faces of his co-workers. He saw hope in some eyes, skepticism in others, and worry in most. These people were counting on him, whether they realized it or not. If the machine couldn't be fixed, if production didn't resume soon, their livelihoods were at stake. The pressure was enormous, but it was a pressure Marcus had felt before, in different forms throughout his career. "All right, Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said finally, extending his hand toward James. "You've got yourself a deal." James shook the offered hand with the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. His grip was firm but soft, the handshake of a man who'd never had to develop real calluses. As their hands separated, Marcus noticed the difference between them. James's manicured fingers versus his own scarred and stained hands that told the story of decades spent making things work. The crowd of workers began to disperse, some returning reluctantly to their other duties, while others found reasons to linger nearby. Word of the challenge would spread quickly through the facility, Marcus knew. By the end of the shift, everyone would know about the bet between the billionaire owner and the veteran mechanic. Marcus approached the silent machine with renewed purpose, his earlier fatigue forgotten. The next few hours would determine not just whether production resumed, but whether years of experience and intuition could triumph over expensive expertise and technological arrogance. As he opened his toolbox and began to examine the machine more closely, the Texas sun continued to beat down relentlessly, but Marcus Thompson had faced greater challenges than heat before. If you're enjoying this incredible story of determination and unexpected wisdom, don't forget to show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe for more amazing content, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Now, let's continue with Marcus's incredible journey. The afternoon heat had intensified to an almost unbearable degree, turning the factory floor into a furnace that tested the limits of human endurance. The air conditioning units wheezed and groaned overhead, fighting a losing battle against the combination of external temperature and the heat generated by dozens of running machines. Sweat dripped steadily from Marcus's forehead as he methodically examined every inch of the silent assembly unit, but his focus never wavered. For the past 2 hours, Marcus had been conducting the most thorough diagnostic examination of his career. He'd removed access panels with surgical precision, traced electrical connections with the patience of a master craftsman, and tested components with an arsenal of tools that had served him faithfully for decades. His movements were deliberate and economical, the result of years spent working in cramped spaces under impossible deadlines. "Still banging away at that thing, Thompson." James's voice carried across the factory floor as he returned from what appeared to be an extended lunch break. His white shirt remained impossibly crisp despite the oppressive heat, and he carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted the outcome of this particular challenge. Marcus didn't look up from the control panel he was examining. His calloused fingers traced the intricate network of wires and circuits, feeling for the subtle variations in temperature and tension that often revealed hidden problems. "Just getting acquainted with her," he replied calmly. "Every machine has its own personality. You've got to listen to what she's trying to tell you." James let out another dismissive laugh, but this one carried a slight edge of impatience. "Thompson, I've got a conference call with investors in an hour. They're going to want answers about when production will resume. How much longer are you planning to play around with this thing?" The question hung in the air, like the oppressive humidity. Several workers who had been trying to appear busy with their own tasks found reasons to drift closer, their curiosity overcoming their caution. Word of the bet had indeed spread throughout the facility, and Marcus could feel the weight of their collective attention even without looking up. "Problems like this," Marcus said, finally straightening up and wiping his hands on his rag. "They don't usually announce themselves with fanfare. The obvious stuff gets caught during routine maintenance." When something stumps the experts, it's usually because the real issue is hiding in plain sight. He gestured toward the diagnostic equipment that had been left behind by the previous teams of specialists. Expensive laptops displayed complex readouts, sophisticated meters showed various measurements within normal parameters, and high-tech sensors had apparently found no faults in any of the major systems. All this fancy equipment, Marcus continued, it's designed to find specific types of problems. But sometimes the issue isn't in the database of known faults. Sometimes it's something that only shows up when you understand how all the pieces work together. James checked his expensive watch with obvious impatience. Thompson, with all due respect to your intuitive approach, I need concrete results. The manufacturer's engineers ran comprehensive diagnostics. The control systems passed every test. The mechanical components check out perfectly. The electrical systems are functioning within specified parameters. That's exactly the problem, Marcus replied, a note of excitement creeping into his voice for the first time since the challenge began. Everything tests fine individually, but the machine still won't run. That tells me we're dealing with an integration issue, something that only becomes apparent when all the systems try to work together. He moved to a section of the machine that previous investigators had largely ignored, a junction box located low on the frame where multiple cable harnesses converged. It was an unglamorous component, the kind of thing that sophisticated diagnostic equipment might overlook in favor of more complex systems. See, the thing about German engineering, Marcus explained as he carefully opened the junction box, is that it's incredibly precise. Every connection has to be perfect. Every component has to meet exact specifications. But that precision can also be a weakness if something gets even slightly out of alignment. Inside the junction box, Marcus found exactly what his experience had suggested he might find. A single connector, one of dozens in the complex assembly, showed signs of thermal stress. The plastic housing had begun to deform slightly, creating a connection that tested as functional under static conditions, but failed under the dynamic loads of actual operation. This connector, Marcus said, holding up the offending component for James to see, probably got overheated during installation or maintenance. The plastic warped just enough to create intermittent contact. When the machine tries to start, the increased current flow causes the bad connection to heat up and fail, which triggers the safety systems to shut everything down. James moved closer, his skepticism warring with genuine curiosity. But the diagnostic equipment would have detected a faulty connection. Not necessarily, Marcus explained patiently. The connection works fine when the system is at rest. It only fails under load. And by the time the diagnostic equipment can register the fault, the safety systems have already shut everything down. To the computers, it looks like a random system failure with no clear cause. The crowd of workers had grown larger as word continued to spread through the facility. Even supervisors from other departments had found excuses to wander by, drawn by the unprecedented drama unfolding on the factory floor. The tension was palpable. Everyone understood that this moment would be remembered and talked about for years to come, regardless of the outcome. Marcus carefully extracted the faulty connector and examined it under a magnifying glass he'd pulled from his toolbox. The damage was subtle but unmistakable to his experienced eye. A slight warping of the plastic housing that would be invisible to casual inspection, but catastrophic to the precise tolerances required by modern manufacturing equipment. "The fix itself is simple," Marcus announced, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Replace this $20 connector with a new one, and the machine should run perfectly." The real trick was finding it among thousands of similar components. James stared at the small plastic piece in Marcus's weathered hand, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a grudging acceptance of what he was seeing. The idea that a $20 part could bring down a $2 million machine, and that a factory worker could find the problem when his team of experts couldn't, challenged everything he believed about the relationship between cost and competence. "You're telling me," James said slowly, "that all of this downtime, all the lost production, all the expensive consultants and diagnostic equipment, it all comes down to a $20 connector that got a little too hot." "Sometimes the biggest problems have the smallest causes," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "That's why experience matters. I've seen this kind of failure before, in different machines and different contexts. When you've spent enough time working with equipment, you develop an instinct for where to look when everything else checks out fine." The murmur of conversation among the watching workers grew louder as the implications of Marcus's discovery sank in. If he was right, if this simple fix would restore the production line, then they'd just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when practical experience had triumphed over theoretical knowledge, when a man's character and skill had proven more valuable than his credentials or background. Marcus retrieved a replacement connector from the spare parts inventory, a process that took only minutes despite the careful documentation required for such critical components. The installation itself was straightforward. Disconnect the old connector, install the new one, and secure the connection according to the manufacturer's specifications. But every movement was watched with intense concentration by dozens of pairs of eyes. As Marcus worked, the factory floor fell into an unusual quiet. The normal sounds of production continued in the distance, but in the immediate area around the assembly line, even the casual conversations had stopped. Everyone understood that they were witnessing a defining moment, not just for Marcus and James, but for the entire facility and everyone who worked there. "There," Marcus said finally, straightening up and wiping his hands one more time. "Let's see if she'll talk to us now." He moved to the machine's control panel and began the startup sequence that had failed countless times over the past 3 days. The initial power-up proceeded normally, as it had every previous time. Status lights flickered on in sequence, diagnostic routines ran their checks, and for a few moments, everything seemed exactly as it had during all the previous failed attempts. Then something different happened. The machine's main motor, silent for 3 days, gave a low hum that grew steadily in volume. Hydraulic systems pressurized with a satisfying hiss, and the complex array of robotic arms began to move through their calibration sequences with the precise, choreographed motion of a ballet performed by mechanical dancers. The assembled crowd held its collective breath as the machine completed its startup routine and began its first production cycle. Components moved through the assembly process with fluid precision, each operation executed exactly as the German engineers had designed it to work. After 3 days of stubborn silence, the multi-million-dollar production line was running perfectly. The cheers that erupted from the watching workers echoed off the concrete walls and steel roof of the factory. Months of worry about job security, weeks of tension about the failed production line, and hours of anxiety about the outcome of this unprecedented challenge all found release in that moment of celebration. Even workers from other parts of the facility, drawn by the commotion, joined in the applause as news of Marcus's success spread through the building. But in the center of the celebration, 2 men stood in silence. Marcus Thompson, his work shirt soaked with sweat and his hands still stained with grease, watched the machine he'd just brought back to life with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Beside him, James Hartwell III stared at the same machine with an expression that cycled through disbelief, embarrassment, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Around them, the celebration continued, but both men understood that something fundamental had shifted. The bet had been won and lost, but the real change went deeper than that. It was a change in understanding, in assumptions about value and worth, and in the recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. James looked at Marcus, then at the machine, then back at Marcus again. The $20 connector sat on a nearby workbench, a small piece of plastic that had humbled a billionaire and vindicated a mechanic. In that moment, both men knew that the hardest part of this story was yet to come. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the factory roof, but inside, the air seemed to have shifted. The machine ran on, its steady rhythm marking time as two very different men prepared to face the consequences of their agreement. The bet had been clear, the terms unambiguous, and the outcome undeniable. Now it remained to be seen whether pride or honor would prevail in the next chapter of this unexpected drama. As the initial celebration began to die down and workers reluctantly returned to their duties, Marcus began cleaning up his tools with the methodical care of someone who had learned to respect his equipment. He said nothing, made no demands, offered no reminders of what had been promised. He simply went about his work with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. But everyone in that factory knew what came next. The question wasn't whether James would honor his word. It was how he would choose to do it, and what it would mean for everyone who witnessed it. The Texas heat continued to press down on the building, but inside, the temperature of human drama was about to reach its own boiling point. The machine hummed on, its steady operation a testament to the power of experience, intuition, and the kind of knowledge that couldn't be bought with money or learned from textbooks. And in that hum, everyone present could hear the sound of change. Not just the change that comes from fixing a broken machine, but the deeper change that happens when assumptions are challenged and people are seen for who they really are, rather than who they appear to be. Marcus closed his toolbox with a satisfying click and stood up slowly, his knees protesting after hours of crouching and crawling around the massive machine. He looked at James one more time, his expression neutral, but his eyes holding a quiet expectation. The ball was now in the billionaire's court, and everyone in the factory was waiting to see how he would play it. The production line continued its perfect operation, each cycle completing exactly as designed, each component moving through its assigned path with mechanical precision. It was a beautiful thing to watch, the culmination of decades of engineering expertise brought to life by the insight of a man who understood that sometimes the most sophisticated problems have the simplest solutions. But the real drama was just beginning. The machine was fixed, the bet was won, and now it was time to see what happened when pride met its match in the most public way possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered long after the details of the technical problem were forgotten. And in the gathering crowd of workers, supervisors and managers who had heard about the incredible events of the day, anticipation mixed with apprehension as everyone waited to see whether James Hartwell III was a man of his word. The next few minutes would reveal not just his character, but the character of the company he owned and the culture he had created within these walls. The machine continued its steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that counted down the moments until truth would be tested and honor would be measured. In that rhythm, the future of Hartwell Manufacturing and the relationships between the people who made it work hung in the balance. James stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing through possibilities and calculations. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the facility focused on him, waiting to see what kind of man he really was when stripped of his power and privilege and faced with the simple requirement to keep his word. The machine hummed on, indifferent to human drama, but somehow central to it, its perfect operation a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are found in the most unexpected places. And as the afternoon shadows grew longer and the Texas heat began its slow retreat toward evening, everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would change everything, or reveal that nothing had changed at all. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no hiding from it. The bet had been made, the challenge had been met, and now it was time to discover whether honor existed in the heart of a man who had never had to humble himself before. The story was far from over, but the most crucial chapter was about to begin. Around them, the factory continued its work, machines running with mechanical precision while human drama played out in their shadows. It was a fitting backdrop for what was to come, a place where function mattered more than form, where results spoke louder than promises, and where a man's true character was about to be revealed in front of everyone who had ever questioned whether his word could be trusted. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the audience was waiting. All that remained was to see whether pride would bow to honor, or whether some promises were too costly for even a billionaire to keep. The machine's steady hum provided the soundtrack for what was about to unfold, a mechanical metronome marking time until the moment when everything would change. And in that moment, suspended between promise and fulfillment, between pride and humility, between the old way of thinking and something entirely new, the future of Hartwell Manufacturing and everyone in it waited to be born. The bet was won, the machine was running, and now it was time to discover what happened when a billionaire's word was put to the ultimate test. The final act of this drama was about to begin, and no one in that factory would ever forget what they were about to witness. The question was no longer whether Marcus could fix the machine. That question had been answered with the decisive hum of perfectly functioning equipment. The question now was whether James Hartwell III was the kind of man who honored his commitments, regardless of the cost to his pride. The answer would come soon enough, and when it did, it would echo through the halls of Hartwell Manufacturing for years to come. The machine continued its work, patient and reliable, while the humans around it prepared to discover truths about themselves and each other that would reshape their understanding of what really mattered in a world where respect had to be earned rather than bought. The transformation was about to begin, and it would start with a simple act that would prove whether character was measured by the size of a man's bank account or by the strength of his word. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no escaping it. The bet was won, the stakes were clear, and honor was about to be tested in the most public way possible. The machine hummed on, indifferent to human pride, but somehow central to its humbling marking time, until the moment when everything would change forever. And in that hum, everyone present could hear the sound of a future being born, a future where worth was measured by deeds rather than titles, where respect was earned rather than assumed, and where the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. The story was reaching its climax, and no one in that factory would ever be quite the same after witnessing what was about to unfold. The machine had been fixed, the bet had been won, and now it was time to discover whether a billionaire's promise was worth more than his pride. The answer would come soon enough, and when it did, it would change everything for everyone present. The moment stretched on, heavy with possibility and pregnant with change, while the machine continued its perfect operation and the humans around it prepared to discover what happened when honor met pride in the most public arena possible. The final chapter was about to begin, and no one knew how it would end, except that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Then, slowly, James Hartwell III began to move. The crowd held its breath as he took his first step toward fulfilling a promise that would cost him more than money ever could. The machine hummed on, patient and steady, providing the rhythm for what was about to become the most important moment in the history of Hartwell Manufacturing. And in that moment, everyone present understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Not just the humbling of a proud man, but the birth of something new and better in the relationship between those who owned and those who worked, between those who commanded and those who served, between those who assumed and those who earned. The transformation was beginning, and it would start with a simple act that would echo through the halls of this factory for generations to come. The bet was won, the promise was due, and honor was about to be tested in the crucible of public scrutiny. What happened next would define not just James Hartwell III, but the very soul of the company that bore his name. The machine continued its work, steady and reliable, while the humans around it prepared to discover whether promises mattered more than pride, whether character could triumph over comfort, and whether a man could be bigger than his own ego when faced with the simple requirement to keep his word. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no hiding from it anymore. The story was about to reach its conclusion, and everyone present would carry the memory of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. The machine hummed on, marking time until honor was tested and found either worthy or wanting in the harsh light of public judgment. James stood at the crossroads of his own character, about to discover whether he was the man he'd always believed himself to be or something entirely different. The workers watched in silence. The machine ran with perfect precision, and the future of everything they'd built together hung in the balance of a single moment that would define them all. The final act was about to begin, and no one would ever forget what they were about to see. The bet was won. The machine was running, and now it was time to discover what happened when a billionaire's word was put to the ultimate test in front of everyone who had ever doubted whether his promises meant anything at all. The transformation was coming, and it would start with the simple act of a man keeping his word, regardless of the cost to his pride. The machine hummed on, steady and sure, providing the soundtrack for what was about to become the defining moment in the history of Hartwell Manufacturing and everyone who worked there. The moment stretched on, pregnant with possibility, while honor and pride prepared to meet in the most public arena possible. The outcome would determine not just the fate of a bet, but the future of a company and the relationships between all the people who made it work. The machine continued its perfect operation, indifferent to human drama, but somehow central to it, marking time until everything changed forever. And in that moment, suspended between promise and fulfillment, between the old way and something entirely new, everyone present understood that they were about to witness history in the making. The bet was won, the stakes were clear, and honor was about to be tested in the crucible of public judgment. What happened next would echo through the halls of this factory for generations to come. The machine hummed on, patient and steady, while the humans around it prepared to discover whether character was stronger than comfort, whether promises mattered more than pride, and whether a man could rise above his own assumptions to become something better than he'd ever been before. The moment of truth had arrived, and no one would ever forget what they were about to see. The transformation was beginning, and it would start with a simple act that would change everything for everyone present. The story was reaching its climax, and the machine's steady rhythm provided the heartbeat for what was about to become the most important moment in all their lives. Honor was about to be tested, pride was about to be challenged, and the future was about to be born in the most unexpected way possible. The final chapter was about to begin, and no one in that factory would ever be quite the same after witnessing what was about to unfold. The machine continued its work, steady and sure, while the humans around it prepared to discover what happened when a billionaire's word was tested in the harsh light of public scrutiny and found either worthy or wanting. The moment had come, and there was no escaping it anymore. The bet was won. The promise was due, and honor was about to triumph or fail in front of everyone who had ever questioned whether it existed in the heart of a man who had never had to humble himself before. The machine hummed on, marking time until everything changed forever. And then, finally, James Hartwell III made his choice. The silence that followed stretched across the factory floor like a held breath, while the machine continued its steady operation, and everyone present waited to see whether a billionaire's word was worth more than his pride. The transformation was about to begin, and it would start with the simplest and most powerful act of all, a man keeping his promise, regardless of the cost. The machine hummed on, patient and steady, providing the rhythm for what was about to become the most important moment in the history of Hartwell manufacturing. And in that rhythm, everyone present could hear the sound of change coming. Change that would start with honor and spread through every corner of their lives. The final act was beginning, and no one would ever forget what they were about to witness. The bet was won, the machine was running, and now it was time to discover what happened when character met its ultimate test in the most public way possible. The future was about to be born, and it would start with a simple act that would echo through the halls of this factory for generations to come. As the machine continued its perfect operation, James slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to his knees on the concrete floor of his own factory. The sound of his expensive shoes against the rough surface seemed to echo through the sudden silence like thunder. His white shirt, still somehow immaculate despite the oppressive heat, stood out starkly against the industrial backdrop as he fulfilled the promise that had seemed impossible just hours before. The watching workers stood in stunned silence, many of them unable to believe what they were seeing. This was James Hartwell III, the man who owned everything they could see and much that they couldn't, humbling himself before a mechanic whose hands were still stained with grease and whose clothes marked him as just another worker on the factory floor. "I was wrong," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the factory floor despite its quiet tone. "Marcus Thompson knows more about these machines than all my expensive consultants combined. I made assumptions based on appearances and credentials instead of recognizing real expertise when I saw it." He looked up at Marcus from his position on the floor, and for the first time since anyone could remember, there was no arrogance in his expression. "I apologize for my attitude, Marcus. You've earned my respect today, and I hope I can earn yours going forward." Marcus stood quietly for a moment, looking down at the man who had mocked him just hours before. Then he extended his hand, helping James to his feet with the same steady strength that had fixed the impossible machine. "Respect isn't something you inherit, Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said simply. "It's something you earn every day by how you treat people and whether you keep your word. Today you kept yours." The applause that erupted from the watching workers was different from their earlier celebration. This wasn't just about a fixed machine or a won bet. It was about witnessing a moment of genuine human transformation, seeing someone rise above their own limitations to become something better. James brushed the dust from his knees and straightened his shirt, but something fundamental had changed in his bearing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility tempered with newfound understanding. "I think," James said, his voice thoughtful, "it's time I learned more about how this factory really works. Marcus, would you be willing to teach me? I clearly have a lot to learn about the people who make my company successful." Marcus smiled for the first time all day, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "I'd be honored to, Mr. Hartwell. There's always more to learn, and the best teachers are usually the ones with grease under their fingernails." As the crowd began to disperse, workers returning to their duties with renewed energy and purpose, the machine continued its steady operation. But something had changed in the rhythm of the factory itself, not just in the mechanical heartbeat of production, but in the human relationships that made it all possible. The $20 connector that had caused so much trouble sat forgotten on a nearby workbench, a small piece of plastic that had somehow managed to bring down walls that money and position had built over decades. It was a reminder that the most important problems often have the simplest solutions, and that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. James stayed on the factory floor longer than he ever had before, asking questions, listening to answers, and beginning to understand that the true value of his company lay not in its buildings or machines, but in the knowledge and dedication of the people who made it work. Marcus proved to be a patient teacher, explaining not just how things worked, but why they mattered and how each person's contribution fit into the larger picture. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Houston horizon, casting longer shadows across the factory floor, both men understood that this day had changed everything. A bet had been won and lost, a machine had been fixed, and a promise had been kept. But more importantly, two very different men had discovered that respect and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps in background and circumstance. The machine hummed on, its steady operation a testament to the power of experience and intuition over expensive equipment and impressive credentials. And in that hum, everyone who worked at Hartwell Manufacturing could hear something new. The sound of a workplace where people were valued for who they were and what they could contribute, rather than judged by their appearance or background. The transformation was complete, born from a simple bet, and nurtured by the courage to keep a promise when it cost more than money could measure. James Hartwell III had learned that true leadership meant recognizing excellence wherever it appeared, and Marcus Thompson had demonstrated that dignity and skill were not diminished by modest circumstances. As the day shift ended and workers began to file out of the factory, many of them stopped to shake Marcus's hand or offer their congratulations. But the real victory wasn't in fixing a machine or winning a bet. It was in the knowledge that their workplace had become something better, a place where every person's contribution was valued and where respect was earned rather than assumed. The $20 connector would eventually find its way into the company museum, a small artifact that told a big story about the day when assumptions were challenged and found wanting, when pride gave way to humility, and when two very different men discovered they had more in common than either had imagined. The machine continued its perfect operation, steady and reliable, its rhythm marking time in a factory that had been transformed not by new equipment or corporate restructuring, but by the simple recognition that wisdom and worth could not be measured by the cost of a man's clothes or the size of his office. The story would be told and retold in the halls of Hartwell Manufacturing for years to come, growing with each telling but never losing its essential truth, that respect must be earned, promises must be kept, and the most important lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers. The machine hummed on, patient and steady, while the humans around it continued to learn and grow and discover new ways to value each other's contributions. And in that hum, everyone who heard it could recognize the sound of a workplace transformed, where people were judged by their character and contributions rather than their appearance or credentials. It was the sound of possibility made real, of promises kept and respect earned, of a future built on the foundation of mutual understanding and shared purpose. The bet was over, the machine was running, and the real work of transformation was just beginning. But as the Texas sun set over Hartwell Manufacturing, casting the factory in warm, golden light, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something special, a moment when human dignity triumphed over prejudice, when character proved stronger than circumstances, and when a simple act of keeping one's word changed everything for everyone involved. The machine continued its work, steady and sure, marking time in a place where respect was no longer assumed but earned, where expertise was recognized regardless of its source, and where the most important victories were measured not in dollars or productivity, but in the strength of the human connections that made everything else possible. The story would echo through the halls of Hartwell Manufacturing for generations to come, a reminder that transformation begins with the courage to see people for who they really are rather than who they appear to be, and that the most valuable lessons often come wrapped in the most humble packages. The machine hummed on, patient and reliable, while the humans around it continued to discover new ways to respect and value each other's contributions to their shared success. And that incredible story of respect, humility, and the power of keeping your word reminds us all that true worth isn't measured by wealth or position, but by character and integrity. If this story touched your heart like it did mine, please give it a thumbs up. subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales, and hit that notification bell to never miss our latest content. What did you think of James's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, remember that respect is earned, promises matter, and sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers.